welcome to the channel. I am here today to discuss the book Painfully Obvious, and joining me today is the author Raymond Farmer. Thank you.
Giving myself my own applause.
We are happy to have you here with us to share your collection of life stories.
Thank you. This is self-published, just out maybe less than 3 months. It's been a hobby of mine to write, most of my life since I was a child. And I just thought last year, 2024 into 2024, that was the time to put this out, to put something creative out into the world and see how it would be received.
Absolutely. And we spoke earlier about you wanting to put something out into the universe to share your experience. And can you tell us a little bit about your planning in terms of introducing the reader to the setting of Baltimore, the city of Baltimore?
Okay. Well, first I should say we were born in Baltimore. So that part, sort of a natural fit. But this collection of stories, Baltimore is definitely a background or the setting for a lot of what happens, the events and the characters and what they're going through and experiencing. And, to me, Baltimore has always been sort of this sort of interesting dichotomy of a place, because when you're from Baltimore, you never think anyone else would ever want to come to Baltimore. It sort of feels like this is my space, my place, and it's not maybe the most beautiful thing in the world, but it's what I know, what I'm familiar with. But then you hear people saying, "Oh, I brought my family on vacation to Baltimore." It's like, who vacations in Baltimore?
Wait a minute now.
And so at least for me, it's always like a reminder that there's more to the city than what you think, even though you live here or have lived here for decades. And with these stories, I wanted the reader to kind of get a sense of what it feels like to be working in Baltimore, to be living in Baltimore, to be going through life events with Baltimore as the backdrop, and how the city is as much a part of what you're doing or what you're experiencing as your friend or spouse or child might be in the same way. It's I don't want to say a city can be a family member, but that connection to it can be just as familiar as a family member.
Well, I think the places that we visit, and especially the places where we choose to reside and settle down, they do carry energy.
Mm-hmm.
And you can feel it in the different pockets or the different neighborhoods that you go into.
Mm-hmm.
The city has a culture, or even kind of a pulsing heartbeat to it. No different than being in Philly or New York.
Yep.
So I can connect with having this. That it has a certain energy to
Mm-hmm.
it that you really have to be here to experience. It's more than just crabs and.
And I like what you just said about the neighborhoods, because that reminded me, like the very first story is set in a very specific neighborhood, and then later on there's a story, 1222, that's set in a very specific neighborhood, and the neighborhood is part of the experience and the journey that the characters are going through, what's around them, the types of houses, the types of yards, the types of people in those neighborhoods. So, and that's really, for people who have never been to Baltimore or don't, or curious about it, Baltimore, like every city, is made up of neighborhoods, but these neighborhoods are very distinct. And the culture of them is in itself its own story.
And in that story, you speak about being one of the first African American families to move into that neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
which is certainly not just isolated to Baltimore, but anyone else could speak about that experience. Can you speak a little bit about that story?
Yeah, I think when we moved there, and this was when my parents bought their first home. So I was about 10 years old at the time, maybe eight or nine, not quite 10. We moved because we were getting ready to go from elementary school to middle school, so it was also um, a school
It was about school
rationale.
choice.
Yeah, school choice at the time as well. But we were the third black family to move onto that street or that block of that street. And what always struck me, we had other kids who were our age, me and my brother, and played, rode bikes. This was in the days where everyone didn't get sent off to a day camp or a summer camp. School was out in the summer. Everyone just played in the street and in the yard and in the alley. But like I said, I would say within 4 years. So we moved there when I was about to start middle school, which would have been sixth grade. So a lot of my friends were also in middle school or starting middle school as well. By the time high school started, almost all of those families had moved away.
Hmm.
It was, what's called white flight. But all of the families that had school age children, um, it was almost every 3 or 4 months we saw a for sale sign going up in the neighborhood that we had moved into, um, 2 or 3 years before, and it was a drastic change. It wasn't drastic because these white families left and black families moved in. It wasn't only black people moving into the neighborhood. It was just drastic that it seemed like as a collective they all decided to leave. Um, Something that happens, I guess, within our culture and not specific to Baltimore. I think it's just America and American history at work, but this sense that the neighborhood is changing when one segment or group moves into it, and that change is something the other group needs to get away from.
And we can also relate that to gentrification,
Yeah,
where
to
you
an extent.
kind of have the opposite. You have a brown or black community that is kind of infiltrated by non-brown and black
Mhm.
society, and it's especially I see a lot when there's a artistic uh, bend behind it, where you bring in these artists or these painters or something related to the arts, and it completely changes the community. But it also increases the rent rates, or the property taxes, and all these things go up. Um,
Yeah, no, I mean gentrification, because I work in Washington D.C. I've seen it happen over the past decade, just in neighborhoods I used to drive through going home, um, where it would be unusual to see a blonde-haired woman jogging with a baby stroller through that neighborhood, and now that's very common in certain parts of the city. But that's also you're also talking about financial means, income inequality. Um, as well as the cultural change. It's what people earn, what people are able to afford, and the houses that are built for that, um, that specific demographic,
and I see a
which is
lot of
outside of color, I think, and speaking to high earners versus low earners.
yes, and I see a lot of that theme play out in multiple stories within the book, where the character is struggling with being young and on your own, and getting your first job, and how you navigate the relationships on your job. One of the stories, the story of the young man is working for a retail store,
Mm-hmm.
and I can clearly see the dynamics of being friendly and cordial, and even having some rapport with your work associates, but then behind closed doors or even outside of that workplace, they the relationship is kind of strained. It's not a real friendship or connection.
Mm-hmm.
It's I'm just interacting with you because I have to work with you. Does that?
Yeah, if it's a story I think you're referring to, which was Better with the Broom. Is that the
Yes.
one? Okay, so yeah, so I think it was less. I mean, I love to hear people tell me what they got out of the story. So, um, not that I'm trying to correct them. You should get out of the story what you get out of it. I want you to have that experience with emotionally attaching to it.
Mm.
But I think of that story as less of. I think of the story that the friendships the character built were real, but what was new, and it ties into why the book, the collection is called Painfully Obvious, is that um, they were real with a power dynamic between the manager types and the worker types, who were all young and mostly part time employees, as opposed to these professionals who this was their career, and their career was being a retail store manager. And that's not to knock that profession, but we're not talking about curing cancer here. We're talking about handling clothes and shoes and shipments and things like that. And how this was a position of power for people who weren't really, or at least in one character's case, for a person who was not really um, emotionally equipped to essentially lead younger people. He was a flawed person who had some biases, and those biases played into how he ran the store. Um, so, but I do think it's interesting that um, as a reader, you saw that there was just I guess a phoniness in the relationship.
Yes.
When in fact, what was obvious in the relationships is that there was just a power imbalance, and that power imbalance was based on personal bias, at least from the one manager character.
Well, in reading the stories, I kind of felt that um, a lot of the characters were not like certain things were omitted out of the stories or about the characters to create the sense that there are two sides to the person, what they want you to see and what they are presenting, and who they really truly are. So I saw that polarity kind of happening in a lot of the characters, especially when the main character is in some type of work setting or uh, some setting where their skills have to come into play.
Yeah.
And like you said, the power dynamic. I'm going to show this side of myself, but it's a facade of who or I'm trying to hide something. Do you feel like some of the characters are in that?
Probably
polarity?
the most extreme version of that is in God at the Hi Ho Bar and in El Sur Grande. El Sur Grande, not to give the whole story away, but it's basically about a hitman. Is it?
It's good.
But it's about a hitman who's on a road trip, and so it's set up from, again, what I want the reader to try to do is put themselves into the character's POV, point of view. And so here's a guy who's gone somewhere he's never been before, and he's excited to an extent about what he's seeing and what he's experiencing, but he's also there because of a job he recently completed. And in God in the High Ho Bar, we've got a very flawed character who is not aware of his flaws until a very, a life altering event happens. While he's doing something that is completely natural to him, spending the day gambling and drinking. And he's left a lot of damage in his wake and in his life, in relationships, but none of that really registers to him. To your point, he presents himself to the world as this sort of, happy-go-lucky, I like to eat and drink and smoke and bet on the horses and do all this other stuff. But all around him is damage. And that damage is carried with him. And, I think of all of the stories in the book as stories about loss, and stories about how people are accepting it or processing loss, whether it's lost childhood, lost parent, lost relationship, lost life, and as they're processing it, coming to what are the obvious truths, which is why the title is Painfully Obvious, because getting to that can be painful. So.
Yes.
Put it out there in a way that looks professional and create something that can be put out into the universe and see where it goes and see what it turns into. Um, but I'm not dependent on the 9.99 book sales. I'm not trying to get rich from it. I do want it to be seen. I do want it to be read. I do want people to have a feeling about it, to have emotion from it, to maybe even be entertained by it. Um, but I really viewed it as a project to put something out into the universe, something creative, and see what it turns into.
Hmm. And I think that's something we're all trying to grasp onto is what can I create that I'm leaving behind
Mm-hmm.
and that other people can connect to and maybe learn from it, connect with it, um, understand it's not just happening to me, it's happened to someone else. What can I learn from that to contribute to my own growth?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the other thing we were talking about earlier is like everyone has a story to tell.
Mhm.
I think everyone has a story to tell. And that story doesn't have to be funny. It doesn't have to be sad. It doesn't have to be some cathartic experience that changes or transforms. It could just be your story, and you want it heard. You want to put it out there, and just maybe just release it from yourself.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. I have some clients who come to me that are, they get to a certain age, they're past 30 or they're past 40, and they have these stories and they don't know if it's the right time, if they are skilled or talented enough that someone wants to actually read what they wrote, or even where to start the process of, okay, I'm writing this down, but now what do I do with it? Do I want to publish it? Is it just for me, for my own personal gain?
Mm-hmm.
And so, can you talk a little bit about why you decided that last year was the proper time for you to get all the stories together and now it's time for me to publish and put it out there?
Yeah, I think, like I said, a lot of the stories in this book were not all written in one sitting. They've been written over 5 to 10 years. I can go back to when I was a little kid and I used to draw comic books. My own, I had my own characters and I put them on the wall, and there's different editions and series, and everyone was like, "Oh, Raymond's always drawing. He likes to draw." But I was actually writing. The comic book was the visual story of what I had written for the plot, for the characters, for the dialogue. So I've been writing a long time, and I went back to school. I was first generation college student in my family, and I was not successful in the first time in the traditional period of an 18, 19-year old. But I went back to school in my 40s and I earned, my bachelor's and my master's. And I majored in history, so I had to do a lot of academic writing, a lot of papers, including my thesis capstone, which was almost 30,000 words. So,
As a collection of your life stories, how did you make the decision when to write in the first person and in the third person?
um, I don't know. I'm trying to think as I thought about what the theme of the story was. Um, I think if my process, if it was a process, was do I want the reader to experience this story um, in an immersive way for them, him or her, or experience it in a third party? And so it kind of, and I wish I could say there was a pattern to it. There really wasn't a pattern to it, but like um, Finding Father or August in Alabama are both themes about losing a parent.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but one, the themes were a little more personal. They were personal to me. They were also personal in the narrative. So I felt like that was a stronger way for the reader to really get sucked in first person, where the other one, Finding Father, is kind of like a narrative over many, many years and kind of jumping from the past to the present. And that made more sense to be in the third person. So it really depended on how I felt writing the story what the way I wanted the reader to come into the story.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah. So one of the things we talk about in astrology is that there is kind of no such thing as the past, present, and future.
Mm-hmm.
We are in a continuum or even repeating what has already been and what's to be. And that we talk about reincarnation and the soul ties, and recently I've seen a lot of these terms being thrown around as it relates to soulmates and soul ties and karma and all these things. And as I read through the book, I'm seeing these relationships and these different dynamics that occur, especially between the family members, where maybe the person is not quite aware why that experience is happening to them, but they know that they're in it, they're
Mm-hmm.
experiencing it, and they're living
Mm-hmm.
it. And you may even encounter uh, people outside of the family, your work associates or your boss, your
Mm-hmm.
manager, people that you meet at school that are kind of uh, in the same characteristics or the same behaviors as something that you've grown up with or you've already kind of experienced or seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so in astrology, I think one of the things that's drawing young people back to astrology is wanting to really understand, why am I in this experience? What is it? Why is it happening to me? And what can I take from it? What can I learn from it? And if you look at those experiences as something to learn from, it's not so much a positive or a negative. It's not really a crisis or a trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It may feel that way, but it's more so this person is here to teach me something or to
Mm-hmm.
give me something, or even a tool that I can use in the future to help me to grow, to help me to evolve, or even to look at, I've seen this before, I've seen this behavior somewhere else, I've seen this pattern somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it being brought back to me again? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things we explore with this notion of karma or cycles of patterns, is that, okay, I've seen this before, I know it's going to come again, maybe in a different person,
Mm-hmm.
maybe in a different situation, maybe even in a different environment. But now I have an understanding of how to handle it the next time I see it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it goes, and all of that involves some sort of interaction with another person or persons. And it's something I say in church sometimes is that we're all here for a reason, and people come in and out of your life for different reasons. And you're here for a reason, and
Mm-hmm.
people you may interact with, even one time for 1 minute, there's a reason for it. So yeah, I think that all sort of fits into that.
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to be with you, not just to promote the book, but also to tie it into that life experience. And um, like you said, what is it that I am giving back to
Mm-hmm.
the community, to the universe as a whole, um, to help maybe someone else to understand, hey, I've seen this before, I've been through this before, someone else is experiencing it, it's not just happening to me,
Mm-hmm.
and what can I learn from it?
And how to survive from it. It shouldn't destroy you. It shouldn't to be the end all be all. A lot of these stories, they have very sharp endings, some of
Mm-hmm.
them. But those endings are not really, it's the end of the story in the book, but it's not the end of the character's story necessarily. So.
But I think those sharp endings also keep you kind of pulled in emotionally and engaged with it, because you're left wondering, okay, well, what happened to the character,
Mm-hmm.
or did they take a different path? Did they make a different decision? It's kind of left very open ended.
Well, but that's where your investment as the reader comes in, and where you are, the story has ended a certain way, and you're like, wow, I wonder what happened next, where they went, how they ended up. Did they go back to this person? Did this thing occur again? And that's what I want the reader to do. is to have that experience, to invest in what more is happening or could be happening now that the part I've read has ended.
Mhm.
So,
Well, thank you for joining us
Thank
today.
you.
I'm grateful to have you with us and for you to devote your time to us.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to reach out to Mr. Farmer for any visits to your bookshop or to speak with him more, have him come to your speaking events, book signings, you're open to as well.
Yep.
His email address is farmerica@comcast.net. I will include that in the description of the video. And you can also purchase Painfully Obvious on Amazon, and I will put the link in the description of the video as well.
Yep. Available in paperback and ebook version.
Yes. Shameless plug. Yes. Thank you. Ashe. Peace.